The weekend had been planned for weeks, circled on their calendar as a break from the rush of daily life. The couple, both in their early 30s, had grown tired of the constant hum of the city and longed for the quiet of the Washington wilderness. With its thick evergreen forests, winding rivers, and snow-dusted peaks, the area promised the kind of isolation that many seek but few ever find. They were known among friends as adventurous yet cautious, never the kind to take unnecessary risks but always eager to explore trails less traveled. On that Friday morning, their excitement was impossible to miss. Neighbors watched them load the truck with their camping gear, a tent, sleeping bags, a cooler of food, fishing rods, and a battered old lantern they had used on countless trips before. They joked about who would win the weekend's fishing contest and who would end up cooking over the campfire. The couple had chosen a remote spot near an alpine lake, one that required a long drive into the backcountry followed by a short hike off the main path. It wasn't a place frequented by weekend travelers, which was exactly why they loved it. The woman packed a small leather-bound journal she always carried, where she would jot down impressions of each trip, the weather, the sounds of the forest, and snippets of their conversations. The man brought his camera, eager to capture the beauty of the mist rolling through the trees at sunrise. For them, the wilderness wasn't just an escape, it was a canvas on which they painted some of their best memories. The weather that day was cooperative. The sky was clear with only a veil of wispy clouds clinging to the mountaintops, and the early autumn air carried the crispness that hinted at colder nights ahead. They both wore wide smiles as they stopped briefly in town to pick up extra supplies, matches, bottled water, and a bag of marshmallows. The cashier would later recall how cheerful they seemed, laughing about who had forgotten to pack the bug spray. It was a small, ordinary moment, but in hindsight, it became one of the last mundane memories anyone had of them. The drive into the mountains took several hours. As the roads narrowed and cell service dropped away, they slipped deeper into a world where only the sounds of rushing streams and the occasional call of a bird filled the silence. They rolled down the windows to breathe in the pine-scented air, pointing out deer grazing in a meadow and stopping briefly to admire a hawk circling high above. Each mile carried them further from civilization, but closer to the tranquility they craved. By late afternoon, they pulled into a gravel turnout near the trailhead, one of the few markers that hinted at human presence in the vast stretch of wilderness. They carefully unloaded their gear, checking each item twice before hoisting backpacks onto their shoulders. The trail wasn't long, but it was narrow, winding through stands of towering Douglas firs and moss-draped branches that created a green canopy overhead. They chatted lightly as they walked, their voices blending with the crunch of boots on soil and the distant murmur of water. The campsite they reached was perfect, perched near the lake where the water shimmered like glass in the fading light. The mountains framed the horizon in jagged silhouettes, and the air grew cooler as the sun dipped lower. They set up their tent in a clearing, its bright fabric standing out against the darkening forest. Together, they unrolled sleeping bags, arranged their belongings neatly, and began preparing their evening meal. The smell of wood smoke soon rose from their fire, curling into the sky, while the sound of sizzling food added warmth to the quiet night. As dusk settled, they sat by the fire, their faces illuminated by the orange glow, laughing softly as they roasted marshmallows. The woman wrote briefly in her journal, describing the way the lake reflected the stars just beginning to appear. The man tested his camera, snapping a few shots of the firelight flickering against the trees. It was, in every way, the kind of evening they had come for, serene, intimate, far from the demands of ordinary life. For anyone looking in from the outside, it was a picture of peace, a couple in love, surrounded by nature, savoring a simple moment that seemed untouched by anything beyond the forest. Yet within this idyllic scene lay the beginning of a story that would take a much darker turn, one that no one present that night, the couple, the forest, or the stars above, could have foretold. It was the last time they would ever be seen alive. The first signs that something was wrong came quietly. On Monday morning, when both of them failed to show up for work, their colleagues assumed perhaps they had decided to extend the trip by another day. After all, it wasn't unusual for campers to lose track of time when surrounded by the peace of the wilderness. But by Tuesday, unanswered calls and messages began to worry their families. Both were known for being responsible, rarely late, always in touch, especially when out on long trips. Their absence felt wrong, out of character, and unsettling. By Wednesday, when there was still no word, a family member drove out to the trailhead, clinging to hope that maybe their truck had broken down or that they had simply lost service. What they found instead only deepened the dread. The truck was still parked exactly where the couple had left it, tucked into the gravel turnout near the dense tree line. It hadn't been moved, and everything inside was in order: extra supplies, jackets folded neatly in the backseat, and even a half-empty water bottle in the cup holder. It looked as though they had stepped out for a hike and would return at any moment. But the forest surrounding the vehicle was silent, heavy, and indifferent. The discovery was immediately reported, and soon rangers were dispatched to investigate. Following the narrow trail that wound into the forest, the searchers came upon the couple's campsite. It was eerie in its normalcy, as though time had paused. The tent was still upright, the flap opened slightly, revealing 2 sleeping bags unrolled inside. A lantern rested by the entrance, and a few personal belongings were neatly arranged just outside. On the picnic bench nearby sat remnants of a meal that looked as if it had been abandoned mid-preparation: a pot with rice inside, half a loaf of bread, and a knife resting across a cutting board. Marshmallow skewers, charred at the tips, leaned against the fire ring where ashes still clung to blackened wood. What struck investigators most was the absence of any sign of a struggle. There were no overturned chairs, no claw marks on the tent, no blood, and no footprints leading away in panic. It looked, unnervingly, as though the couple had simply risen from their campsite and walked calmly into the woods, never to return. Searchers scanned the area carefully, looking for tracks, clothing, or any indication of where they might have gone, but the ground was damp and scattered with fallen needles, leaving little trace of movement. Word spread quickly, and within days, search and rescue efforts were in full motion. Dozens of volunteers, along with trained dogs, fanned out across the trails, calling their names into the misty air. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning from above, while divers probed the lake near the campsite in case an accident had drawn them into the water. Every lead turned up nothing. It was as if the couple had been swallowed by the forest itself. The families clung to hope, but the strangeness of the scene nagged at everyone involved. Why would they leave without their backpacks, jackets, or even their shoes, which still sat inside the tent? Why abandon their food half prepared? The woman's journal was found, but the last entry was nothing unusual. She had described the quiet beauty of the lake and how the stars reflected on its surface. The man's camera contained only a few pictures of their fire and the surrounding forest. There were no hints of distress, no warnings, nothing to suggest what would happen next. As the days stretched on, the search grew more desperate. Authorities considered every possibility: an animal encounter, a fall in the rugged terrain, even foul play. But with no evidence, every theory seemed like speculation. The forest remained stubbornly silent, offering no clues. Nights grew colder, rain swept in from the mountains, and the chances of finding them alive dwindled with each passing hour. By the end of the second week, the operation began to wind down. Volunteers were exhausted, dogs had found no scents worth following, and helicopters had scanned every visible ravine and clearing. The families, refusing to give up, continued to post flyers, plead for tips, and hold vigils, hoping that someone, somewhere, might stumble upon a clue. But the trail had already gone cold. What haunted everyone most was the stillness of the campsite. It stood there for weeks after, untouched by human hands, like a ghost of that last night the couple had spent together. To those who saw it, the scene carried an uncanny weight, as though it held secrets it refused to give up. The tent eventually collapsed in on itself under the weight of rain, the food spoiled, and the forest slowly reclaimed the clearing. Yet the questions lingered, unanswered and sharp: where had they gone? And why had they left everything behind? It was not the chaos of a violent end that chilled the investigators and family members most, but the quiet. That silence, so complete and unexplained, would grow heavier with time, becoming the central, unsettling feature of their disappearance. The search began with urgency, the kind that carries both determination and dread. Within hours of the couple's truck and abandoned campsite being found, local authorities mobilized search and rescue teams. The Washington wilderness, however, was an unforgiving place to look for answers. Towering evergreens cast deep shadows across endless ridgelines, streams cut through mossy ravines, and dense undergrowth turned every step into a battle. Despite the sheer difficulty, dozens of volunteers, rangers, and even trained canine units committed themselves to finding the missing pair. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning the terrain with thermal cameras, while ground teams trudged through mud and tangled brush calling out their names into the heavy silence. For the families, each hour of waiting stretched into unbearable uncertainty. They gathered near the trailhead, clinging to one another, holding out hope that any moment the search teams would emerge from the trees with good news. Flyers were printed and distributed quickly to nearby towns, showing their smiling faces beneath bold letters, "Missing, last seen camping near Lake Wenatchee." Friends created online groups to share updates, and soon the local media picked up the story. Within days, it seemed the whole state was watching, their hearts tied to the unfolding mystery in the woods. But the landscape resisted every effort. The region was known for its rugged terrain and unpredictable weather. By day, fog drifted low, obscuring visibility, while by night, rain fell relentlessly, washing away footprints or other delicate traces that might have helped. Dogs were deployed again and again, circling the campsite, sniffing for any direction to follow, but each time the scent seemed to fade after only a short distance. Divers were sent into the cold, dark lake nearby, combing its depths with sonar and ropes, but no bodies, no clothing, no sign of them turned up. As days stretched into weeks, the search widened. Crews combed miles of trails, marking their grids carefully to avoid overlap. They rappelled into steep ravines, scanned cliff edges, and tracked along the rushing rivers that carved through the valleys. Every lead, every possible broken branch or disturbed patch of soil, was investigated, but each one ended the same: nothing. It was as though the couple had simply dissolved into the mist. Speculation began to seep into conversations. At first, authorities considered the possibility of an animal attack, perhaps a bear or cougar. But such an encounter would have left some sign: blood, torn fabric, drag marks. There was nothing of the sort. Others whispered about foul play, but again, there were no indications: no theft, no tire tracks from another vehicle, no signs of struggle. The couple's belongings were still there, untouched and waiting. As one ranger quietly admitted to a journalist, it's almost as if they stood up, walked into the woods, and vanished into thin air. The families refused to accept silence as an answer. They organized community search groups, bringing in volunteers from neighboring towns, hikers, and even former search and rescue professionals. Candlelight vigils were held near the trailhead, where loved ones prayed for a miracle and pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. Some believed the couple had gotten lost, injured, and were still somewhere waiting. Others feared something darker had happened. The media amplified the mystery. Local news aired nightly updates, showing footage of the dense forest and interviews with exhausted searchers. National outlets soon picked it up too, framing it as one of the most puzzling disappearances in the Pacific Northwest. Social media exploded with theories. Some pointed to human predators in the wilderness, others speculated about hidden dangers in the forest, and a few even leaned toward the supernatural, the idea that the woods themselves had claimed them. For those on the ground, however, the reality was less dramatic but far more painful. Searchers returned day after day, soaked in rain, bruised from climbing over slick rocks and pushing through thorny brush. They carried stretchers in hope but always came back empty-handed. After 2 weeks, official efforts began to wind down. Authorities quietly admitted that with no leads and such hostile terrain, the chances of survival, if survival had been possible at all, were now slim. Still, the families pushed back, insisting that the search continue, raising funds to keep private teams in the field. But the forest remained indifferent. It gave nothing away. The campsite, once so full of life, had grown quiet, its tent beginning to sag with dampness, food rotting on the picnic bench, as though mocking those who searched. The silence that hung over the area grew heavier with each passing day. What should have been a joyful weekend under the stars had become a puzzle too strange and too empty to solve. By the end of the month, the case was officially labeled cold. Flyers continued to hang in nearby towns, but they began to curl at the edges, weather-worn and ignored. Families were left with only questions, the kind that echoed endlessly in the spaces between their memories. How could two people vanish so completely? Why had the forest refused to give them back? The search had ended, but the ache of not knowing had only just begun. The discovery of the couple's abandoned campsite 4 years after their disappearance was nothing short of unsettling. A group of hikers, trekking through the thick Washington woods, stumbled upon what looked like remnants of a temporary camp. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a patch of earth with weathered belongings scattered around. But as they stepped closer, the reality became undeniable. These items had not been touched in years, and nature had begun to reclaim them. A collapsed tent, its fabric bleached by the sun and mottled with mildew, lay partially buried beneath fallen leaves. Nearby, a rusting lantern leaned on its side, the glass shattered. A coffee mug, still intact but stained with time, sat on a rotting log as if waiting for its owner to return. The hikers, uneasy but curious, called in the authorities. When investigators arrived, they carefully combed through the scene, each object painting a picture of two people who had once settled in this very spot. Yet there was no sign of struggle, no indication of hurried departure. Instead, the site radiated an eerie stillness, as though the couple had simply vanished into the trees. What troubled the investigators most was the positioning of the campsite. It wasn't too far from known trails and not deep enough into the wilderness to suggest the pair had gotten irretrievably lost. That raised questions. If they had wandered away from camp, why hadn't they returned? The deeper the authorities looked, the stranger the picture became. About 30 feet from the camp, they discovered something unusual, a rusted woodchipper. Its presence in the remote woods was baffling. Who had brought it there? Why would such a heavy, industrial machine be dragged so far from civilization? Its blades were corroded, its wheels locked with rust, but it had clearly been used before being abandoned. Investigators speculated whether the couple had stumbled across it or whether it had something to do with their disappearance. Either way, the discovery darkened the case considerably. Forensic teams gathered what they could, carefully bagging items for analysis. The tent, lantern, and personal effects were all taken in, though the years of exposure to weather had eroded much of their evidentiary value. The woodchipper, however, was examined closely on site. Detectives knew that such a machine could have been used for sinister purposes, and whispers quickly spread through the small towns nearby that this discovery might hold the key to the couple's fate. Some suggested foul play, that perhaps the pair had been targeted by someone hiding dark secrets in the forest. Others believed the woodchipper might have simply been an old piece of discarded equipment, its presence coincidental yet haunting. The community, once again stirred by the mystery, grew restless. Families who had followed the case for years were desperate for closure. The idea that a loving couple could vanish without a trace was unsettling enough, but now there was the possibility that something much darker had happened in those woods. Volunteers retraced the area for days, scouring the underbrush for bones, clothing, or any evidence of a struggle. They searched creek beds, overturned fallen logs, and pushed deeper into the forest shadows, hoping for clarity. Yet the forest remained silent, keeping its secrets well hidden. The discovery reignited media attention, drawing reporters who speculated wildly on what the woodchipper meant. News broadcasts replayed the couple's smiling faces alongside grim footage of the rusted machine, fueling public intrigue and unease. Investigators, meanwhile, remained tight-lipped, acknowledging the significance of the discovery but refusing to release conclusions without concrete proof. The campsite became a symbol of unresolved tragedy. To some, it felt like a cruel reminder of lives cut short without explanation. To others, it was a clue that demanded persistence. The woodchipper loomed in everyone's mind like a grotesque centerpiece. Was it evidence of a crime, or just a chilling coincidence? For now, it stood there in the forest, weathered but silent, guarding its secrets. The weeks following the discovery in the ravine were heavy with anticipation and dread. For the families of the missing couple, there was relief in finally knowing where their loved ones had ended up, but the comfort was fleeting. Answers were supposed to bring closure, yet the more the investigators revealed, the less sense it all seemed to make. The official confirmation of their identities came through DNA testing, a formality that everyone expected but still hit with the force of a final blow. The sheriff stood before cameras at a press conference, speaking in steady tones about the recovery, about how the families now had something to hold on to. But behind the carefully chosen words, the reality was stark. What happened to them remained a mystery. The journal, though badly damaged, became the most talked about piece of evidence. Fragments of its waterlogged pages had been painstakingly separated and dried, and though much of the writing was smeared into nothing, a handful of entries survived. The words were not detailed accounts but glimpses, hints of unease. One entry mentioned hearing crunching footsteps outside the tent, when neither of them had been moving. Another scribbled line suggested that they felt watched all day, as they hiked, though they hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. The words ended abruptly, unfinished sentences trailing off, leaving far more questions than answers. The investigators released little to the public, but the few phrases that leaked ignited widespread speculation. The phone, too, became the center of fascination. Forensic experts managed to recover corrupted data, blurred images, timestamped close to the time the couple vanished. One photo showed what looked like the forest at night, the flash capturing trees and what might have been a shadowy shape in the distance. Another was a shaky, accidental image, perhaps taken as the phone was dropped. There was no final video, no clear message, only fragments that suggested fear without context. To the families, the images were devastating. They provided a glimpse into their final moments without explaining anything. To the public, they were haunting, fueling theories that ranged from the rational to the fantastical. The families found themselves thrust back into the whirlwind of media attention, something they had endured once before when the disappearance was fresh. Reporters camped outside their homes, asking whether they believed the couple had been stalked, attacked, or simply lost their way. The father of one of the victims stood before the cameras, his face lined with exhaustion, and said quietly, "We don't want theories. We want truth. We just want to know what happened." His plea struck a chord, but truth was proving elusive. Authorities released a cautious statement, acknowledging that the evidence suggested unusual circumstances, but refusing to classify the case as homicide or accident. The terrain where the remains were found was rugged, and experts argued that a fall into the ravine was entirely possible. But others pointed out that the journal's words and the strange placement of belongings hinted at something more sinister. The sheriff's department admitted that foul play could not be ruled out, but with no living witnesses and only fragmented evidence, they were left with more speculation than facts. The public, however, had no such restraint. Online forums buzzed with theories, each more elaborate than the last. Some believed the couple had been the victims of a hidden predator, human or otherwise, who stalked campers in the Washington wilderness. Others argued it was a tragic accident, the journal entries nothing more than nerves heightened by isolation. A few even suggested the couple had stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to see, spiraling into darker conspiracies. For every theory, there were dozens of voices arguing, dissecting the fragments of evidence as if piecing together a puzzle that had no edges. For the families, none of it mattered. What lingered for them was not the speculation but the ache of the unanswered. Birthdays passed without celebration, holidays carried an empty seat at the table, and even with the remains returned for burial, the story felt unfinished. They gathered at a small service, their voices breaking as they spoke of two people who loved the outdoors, who set out on what should have been an ordinary trip and never came home. Friends remembered laughter, shared adventures, the warmth of their presence. But beneath the tributes was a thread of sorrow that refused to let go, because closure requires understanding, and the forest had not given them that. As winter settled back over the Cascades, snow covering the ravine where the belongings had been found, the case officially stalled. The files remained open but inactive, waiting for new evidence that might never come. The disturbing discovery had given back the remains of the missing couple, but not the truth of their final hours. For those who knew them, the silence of the forest seemed to echo louder than ever, a reminder that sometimes the wilderness swallows stories whole, leaving only fragments that refuse to fit together. And so the question lingered in the minds of investigators, families, and strangers alike: what really happened that night in the Washington woods? The disturbing discovery had ended the search, but it had not ended the mystery. It had, in some ways, deepened it. And in the quiet corners of the forest, where wind moved through the trees and shadows stretched across the ground, it felt as though the answer was still out there, buried, waiting, just beyond reach.